I called my talk, of course this was before I planned it, Walking Away from Fear. Now I'm going to give you a subtitle, and it's called Alligators, Boats, and Peace Signs. So there will be alligators in it, and boats, and peace signs. Today our pilgrimage symbolized a story of another journey, of course, the journey in the Holy Land from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And it was a journey that we can imagine took place in a land that was occupied by the military. There were threats of baby killing. And there were families walking who were very poor and who were looking for shelter. So surely they were experiencing many fears. And yet it's also a story that we use to think about hope and expectation, a journey for love, and a promise of peace. So it's mixed with fears, poverty, struggle, and peace. I've done a lot of thinking recently on my own journey. That's what happens when you get to my age. And as a person working for peace for many, many years, I think of fear along the way and walking beyond it. I grew up in a place that my pastor told me was like the Holy Land. It was the desert, he said, like the place where the prophets walked, where Jesus walked. And I grew up on a horse, essentially, riding across that desert, leaping the ravines, and galloping toward the oasis in the distance, getting off and having a sandwich. I felt free. I felt the land was beautiful. The sky overhead was huge. The sunsets and the sunrises were glorious. And on a regular basis, in the middle of the night, our parents got us up. And because it's cold on the desert, we put on jackets. And we put sunglasses in our pockets. And we drove 60 miles north and got out of the car and stood beside the road in the dark with sunglasses on. And then at the very hint of dawn, there was a huge explosion, ear-splitting, and the mushroom cloud rose up. And we did that many, many times. The directions to get as close as possible were laid out in the newspaper and the Times. Interestingly enough, I now recognize that our church group every spring drove out that same highway to around the same area before dawn and climbed the hill and had our Easter sunrise service. Well, it is a holy land. It's the Holy Land of the Western Shoshone. And it is the location of the nuclear test site. And also of the planned national radioactive materials dump site. I was so thrilled with that science and listening to the words of our government saying, even if you're a girl, we need you in science, if you're smart. So go into science so we can compete with the Soviets. Remember that? That's the old enemy. And so I studied chemistry, physics, math, everything I could, studied German rockets, interviewed the atomic energy scientists, and entered college as a chemistry major to design nuclear weapons. Things happened, though. So I didn't pursue that course. But I'm reminded that as a child, I learned a lot about fear. There were enemies. We would hide under our desks with our hands over our heads. Have any of you had that experience?
Yes.
Aha. When we were children, starting in kindergarten, that's what we did. We were afraid we were going to be bombed by the Soviets. I was also taught to hate the Germans and the Japanese because that was the old war and they were still, in our minds, the enemy. I was taught fears of people who were strange to me, strange to us, a different faith, a different skin color, a different language. So where I grew up was in Las Vegas, Nevada, a holy land of sorts. And even as an adult, I've reflected back on how much fear has been in my life. Even though I am a privileged person by the color of my skin and by my education and my upbringing, I've experienced fear by not being hired, refused a job. I was a military wife. They wouldn't hire me. No one would hire me. I remember as a newlywed having no food in our refrigerator. I remember having a baby and being caught between insurance. So we couldn't pay for the baby right away. We had bill collectors calling. Sounds familiar to a lot of what people are experiencing today. I remember the car breaking down and I was alone in a drug neighborhood, and it was very frightening. Only 3 years ago, I was in a terrible accident. It was a hit and run, and I was abandoned. Nobody stopped for a long, long time. And we've all had experiences of fear in our lives. Sometimes they're very minor. We worry about little things like, is your Christmas shopping done? Do you have enough time to get all your work done? Are you losing weight like you should? Little things, minor things. And as I think back, the greatest fears have really been in relationships. How could I possibly disagree with my family, still living in Las Vegas, who has very different ideas about the nuclear test site and war and peace? How could I go back home and be with them and go and protest at the Nevada test site? It was a long time before I could make that jump, before I could take that risk. And oddly enough, it was on Mother's Day. The whole family's gathered with her at the house. She says, well, don't call us if you get arrested. Okay? And I took the Episcopal Peace Fellowship National Board with me. It took 2 years to convince them to go, by the way. We don't want to go to a land where there are lots of girls, gambling, neon, dirt. Okay, it took a long time. But it was a transformative event for them and for me.